Pentagon with ministers of defense from 14 nations to coordinate our political way ahead in the Defeat ISIS campaign. Chairman Dunford returned yesterday from a Chief of Defense meeting in Brussels with 28 NATO nations, plus his counterparts from a dozen additional nations, and they discussed the military aspects of that campaign. Mr. McGurk, President Trump's special envoy and vital State Department leader to the coalition to counter ISIS, returned a few hours ago from his trip to Syria, Iraq, and Jordan. This is our first opportunity to get together, and we took advantage of that for this conference. So today's a good time to update you, describing basically where we're at, what has changed, and the way ahead. President Trump directed the Department of Defense to lead all departments in a comprehensive review of the campaign. We submitted that report, and after his review, he then ordered an accelerated operation against ISIS. So what does that mean? Two significant changes resulted from President Trump's review of our findings. First, he delegated authority to the right level to aggressively and in a timely manner move against enemy vulnerabilities. Secondly, he directed a tactical shift from shoving ISIS out of seized locations in an attrition fight to surrounding the enemy and their strongholds so we can annihilate ISIS. The intent is to prevent the return home of escaped foreign fighters. I want to emphasize here there has been no change to our rules of engagement, and there has been no change to our continued extraordinary efforts to avoid innocent civilian casualties. Despite needing to go into populated areas to break ISIS' hold on their self-described caliphate, despite ISIS purposely endangering innocent lives by refusing to allow civilians to evacuate, and we continue all possible efforts to protect the innocent. You're all aware of the human costs ISIS has exacted: killed, wounded, refugees, merciless control over those regions they hold, the costs to Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon as Syrians and Iraqis have been displaced. In response to ISIS' malicious and unforgivable treatment toward innocents, the world has responded. I emphasize that this is a coalition effort. Since this began in 2014, the coalition has strengthened and expanded. The international team is fully committed at the political and military levels to the destruction of ISIS. A coalition of 68 members, 65 nations with more joining as we speak, plus Interpol, the European Union, and Arab League united in opposition. Sharing intelligence, providing troops and funds for combat, and of no less importance for the post-combat recovery. In late March, our Secretary of State gathered diplomatic colleagues in Washington where they discussed how we would deal with the post-combat aftermath. Secretary Tillerson, Mr. McGurk, and their colleagues in the coalition rightly focused most of their effort on how this ravaged region can recover from ISIS depredations after we free it. 26 of our coalition nations contribute militarily, including more than 4,000 non-U.S. troops in the ground and in the air. Our recent coalition meetings in Brussels, Copenhagen, and elsewhere reflect an energized campaign among contributing nations. Partnering with, of course, the Iraqi security forces in Iraq and the counter-ISIS forces in Syria. So what have we achieved? We have fought ISIS elements from Southeast Asia to Africa. Collaboration among many nations, intelligence services continues to complicate and blunt ISIS operations, even as ISIS continues to pursue and conduct attacks against the United States and our allies through centralized, directed plots, but also through inspired attacks. From the Philippines to Europe and beyond, while ISIS remains dangerous, they are no longer carrying an air of strength. In Afghanistan 2 weeks ago, President Ghani announced we had killed the leader of ISIS Khorasan, plus approximately two-thirds of their strength been killed during very tough operations, mostly in Nangarhar province. France has brilliantly led a 2-year ongoing campaign in the Lake Chad Basin and West Africa to throw ISIS off balance, with 4,000 of their troops on the ground to support our African allies. In Libya, we struck a significant ISIS presence there in January of this year. Our attack against their concentrated strength was highly effective, and ISIS did not own any major territory any longer there. Elsewhere, too, there have been successes. But in Iraq and Syria lies the core area of ISIS, of its geographic caliphate. Recent attacks in Istanbul, Paris, and Brussels were planned and coordinated out of ISIS' so-called capital of Raqqa. Additional imminent threats to many nations require us to move with urgency against all strongholds still in their hands. East Mosul, as you know, has fallen after tough fighting by the Iraqi security forces with U.S. and coalition support. Since January, it is returning to normal with businesses reopening, cleanup underway, and kids back in school. West Mosul, in accordance with tactics changed by President Trump, is surrounded, and our Iraqi partners are in a stiff fight. There is no escape for ISIS, even while we do all that is humanly possible to shepherd the innocent out of harm's way. Tal Afar, which lies to the west of Mosul, is also surrounded, and other pockets of ISIS exist elsewhere in Nineveh, Hawija, and the western Euphrates River Valley of Anbar province. We will continue to fully support the Iraqi security forces and Prime Minister Abadi's government in isolating and destroying ISIS throughout Iraq. In Syria, we support Syrian democratic forces that recently seized Manbij, have taken Tabqa, and are currently attacking with great success to isolate Raqqa. ISIS has additional strength scattered down the Euphrates River Valley to the Iraq border. We will not stop until they, too, are destroyed. I want our Chairman, General Dunford, and our President's Special Envoy, Mr. McGurk, to provide more details, so let me sum up. We are leading a comprehensive international campaign to crush ISIS' claim of invincibility, to deny ISIS a geographic haven from which to hatch murder, eliminate ISIS' ability to operate externally, and eradicate their ability to recruit and finance terrorist operations. Thanks to the leadership and authorities granted by President Trump, thanks to the spirit of dozens of nations committed to this fight, thanks to the nations whose troops have gone toe-to-toe with this terrorist group, with the deepest sympathy for the families that have lost sons and daughters in this fight, and with the greatest respect for the families caught up on the battlefields that we note are also humanitarian fields, we have retaken over 55% of ISIS territory there in the core. Over 4 million people have been liberated, and not 1 inch of territory seized from ISIS has been recaptured recaptured by them. Now let me turn it over to Chairman Dunford and Mr. McGurk for more specifics on our Defeat ISIS campaign. Chairman.
Thanks, Mr. Secretary. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for the opportunity to join Secretary Mattis and Special Envoy McGurk to update you on our progress in the campaign against ISIS. As Secretary Mattis indicated, our partnered approach has brought significant progress. We've reduced ISIS-held territory, limited their freedom of movement, destroyed a great deal of their leadership, reduced the flow of foreign fighters into and from the region, diminished their financial resources, and I think perhaps most importantly, we've undermined the credibility of their narrative that there's a physical caliphate in Iraq and Syria. The Secretary spoke about the territorial gains of the coalition. In addition, coalition airstrikes and ground operations have struck approximately 2,600 ISIS-held gas and oil targets, 1,500 tanker trucks, and that's resulted in ISIS having the lowest revenue at any point since 2014. Coalitions also removed key ISIS leaders from the battlefield. These losses have limited ISIS' ability to plan and direct external attacks, recruit foreign fighters, broadcast their narrative, and fund their brand of terror. In Iraq, we're partnered with the Iraqi security forces. U.S. and coalition forces are providing equipment and intelligence, conducting airstrikes, and advising military leaders. It's important to emphasize that the fighting in Iraq has been done by Iraqi forces, and they've performed remarkably, and is also sacrificed. In Mosul alone, they've suffered approximately 980 killed and over 6,000 wounded. And I just comment as an aside, in addition to the competence that they've demonstrated in Mosul and the sacrifice, the one thing I've seen over time in the 15 months I've been back and forth visiting in Iraq in this particular assignment is the confidence of the Iraqi leadership. Some of you accompanied on my most recent trip, and compared to the fall of 2015 to today, it's very clear when you go over and visit them who is in charge, and the level of confidence of the commanders in their ability to lead and in their soldiers' ability to fight is remarkably different than it was a short time ago. In Syria, working alongside our Turkish ally and partnered forces, we've cleared ISIS elements from the Turkish-Syrian border that's stemming the flow of foreign fighters, weapons, and money to ISIS's front lines. And we estimate that at its peak, foreign fighter flow in Iraq and Syria was 1,500 fighters per month. And today we estimate that those numbers are less than 100 per month. In addition, Syrian Democratic forces are completing their isolation of Raqqa. Raqqa has been the center, as Secretary Mattis mentioned, of planning and directing operations such as the attacks in Paris and Berlin. We're also taking the fight to ISIS outside of Iraq and Syria, attacking their affiliates and any groups that claim allegiance. ISIS is a trans-regional threat, and we have a global approach. Secretary spoke about my recent meeting in NATO. That's just one of many meetings that we have routinely. I'm working very closely with more than 60 of my counterparts to expand the coalition that we have in dealing with ISIS. And our priority clearly is to prevent attacks against the homeland. Our strategic approach is to cut the connectivity between ISIS affiliates and associates, and that's specifically the foreign fighter flow, their illicit resources, and their message. Our objective is to drive down ISIS's capability to a point where local forces, with tailored support from the international community, is able to provide security. And we're doing this today in Libya, Somalia, Syria, Yemen, and Afghanistan. As Secretary Mattis mentioned, the President directed us to find ways to accelerate the campaign, and we've identified opportunities to do that. For example, we recommended to the Secretary, and President Trump approved, the decision to equip the Syrian Democratic Forces early this week, and in Iraq, the decision to allow our advisors to accompany down to the battalion level, particularly in operations in Mosul, complex urban terrain, where our proximity to our Iraqi partners has enabled us to provide better support. And we're going to continue to look for opportunities to accelerate the campaign in the future. Before I take questions, I want to mention that the progress that we've made to date is a reflection of the professionalism and the competence of our men and women in uniform, our diplomats, and our intelligence personnel. And we're also fortunate to have a strong coalition and brave partners on the ground. I've already mentioned the Iraqi and the Syrian sacrifices. As we approach Memorial Day, we should also reflect on the sacrifices of young Americans, most recently Rangers Joshua Rogers and Cameron Thomas in Afghanistan, First Lieutenant Weston Lee in Iraq, and Senior Chief Kyle Milliken in Somalia. Again, thank you. I'll be followed by Special Envoy McGurk.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, Chairman, for the opportunity to describe how our diplomatic efforts are working in lockstep with the military campaign to destroy ISIS and ensure it cannot return. As the Secretary and Chairman just mentioned, ISIS has lost 55,000 square kilometers of territory to coalition-backed forces, and ISIS has retaken none of that ground. The reason for that record are close cooperation between the military and civilian departments and agencies, between a global coalition of 68 members, all supporting partners with influence, courage, and capacity on the ground. As the Secretary mentioned, I just returned from the region this morning, including trips outside Mosul and Raqqa, and met some of the brave Syrians and Iraqis who only months ago were living under the terror of ISIS. And to date, coalition-enabled operations have freed more than 4 million people from areas that had been controlled by ISIS. This is a remarkable record, and we're now working to accelerate these effects with pressure on ISIS's capital of Raqqa and their dwindling areas still under ISIS control in Iraq and Syria. During my recent trip, I again witnessed how our diplomats are fully integrated with our military colleagues around a whole-of-government effort to fulfill President Trump's charge to destroy ISIS and ensure it can never return. As many of you have seen, I wish all the American people could see the extraordinary work that our men and women in uniform are doing, together with our courageous diplomats on the ground in these areas. When Secretary Tillerson hosted all 68 members of our coalition in March, it was significant that he was joined throughout parts of the day by Secretary Mattis, by Secretary Mnuchin, Director Pompeo, Director Coates, and other representatives from across our interagency. This demonstrated the coalition and to the world our united whole-of-government approach as directed by the President. Such cooperation is enabling an anaconda-like approach to suffocate ISIS of its territory, finances, propaganda, and ability to move foreign fighters. So I'll give you some examples. Before a partner force launches a military operation, we do extensive diplomatic and political work at the local levels to try to set conditions for stability after ISIS. Mosul was a central example of this, where we've seen really unprecedented cooperation between the Kurdish Peshmerga forces and Iraqi security forces, working together, fighting together, and taking casualties together. This cooperation has enabled closer political coordination between local, regional, and national governments to help return people to their homes after the battles are won through an innovative post-conflict approach based on empowering people at the local level to restore life to their communities. And we call this stabilization, and it's one of the primary focuses of our global coalition, led particularly by Germany, Italy, France, UAE, Norway, UK, other key contributors. Stabilization is not nation building. We're not attempting to dictate political outcomes, nor is it long-term reconstruction, where projects are chosen by outsiders, often with no connection to the local community, costing and often wasting billions of dollars. Instead, stabilization is a low-cost, sustainable, citizen-driven effort to identify the key projects that are essential to returning people to their homes, such as water pumps, electricity nodes, grain silos, and local security structures, local police. The initial focus on demining key facilities, because ISIS plants explosives in all of these facilities to ensure people can't return, has been a critical focus of our coalition. In Iraq alone, Iraqis trained by our coalition supporting demining have now cleared 34 tons of explosive material. Following demining, experts come in, local workers from the local area, Syrians and Iraqis, to restore key facilities and enable life to return. This is not glamorous work, but it's working. In Iraq, 1.7 million Iraqis are now back in their homes, no longer displaced, no longer refugees or migrants seeking to flee. That record is historically unprecedented in a conflict of this nature, and we give tremendous credit to the government of Iraq and local leaders who have worked cooperatively to stabilize local areas and return local populations. In Mosul, as the chairman just mentioned, the battle's not over. It is approaching its final stages thanks to the historic and really heroic sacrifice of the Iraqi security forces, Kurdish Peshmerga, supported by our coalition. ISIS is now resorting to barbaric tactics, using civilians as shields to hold on to the territory that they still hold. In areas of the city that have been cleared, however, life is starting to return, thanks in no small measure to the stabilization projects, more than 200 now, that have been supported by our coalition, by the United Nations and the Iraqi government. I visited one of these projects last week, a water treatment plant that had been destroyed by ISIS, and since it has been demined, restored by local workers, and then with very limited coalition support, it's now pumping fresh water to 100,000 homes. To date in Mosul, 116,000 displaced civilians have returned, 250,000 boys and girls are back in school, and we're working to ensure that these trend lines continue. Raqqa will use the same model. I just visited a town north of Raqqa where local leaders are organizing for the day after ISIS. And working with local Syrians, as we did before the Mosul operation, we've identified hundreds of critical sites and targets for stabilization projects. After ISIS, we'll work to support demining of those facilities and then their rapid restoration, relying on local workers who know the area and how things get done. The Raqqa campaign will take time, but our core principle holds. After the battle, local people, Raqqawis from the area, should be in charge of their city and enabled to help life return to the streets and invite people to return. A few days ago, I met an Arab leader from the town of Topka, a stronghold of ISIS for over 3 years, just west of Raqqa. He described to us the thousands of foreign fighters from as far away as Trinidad and Tobago who terrorized his community, enslaving women, brainwashing children, and committing public executions. He also said he believes that most of these foreign fighters are now dead, and he's working to organize demining initiatives and ensure the streets are safe for people to return and enable the people of Topka, the local people of Topka, to restore their community. So Raqqa will be no different. Syria, of course, is far more difficult than Iraq. We don't have a government to work with, and we will never work with the Assad regime. We'll require much more from our coalition partners and from the international community. When Secretary Tillerson called on the coalition to support stabilization initiatives back in March, he received an impressive $2.6 billion, much of which is now being spent. But more will be required from our coalition, and we'll look for our partners to maintain to maintain at least 3/4 of stabilization support for every U.S. dollar. The battle for Raqqa is about making the world safer for ISIS, and we will ask much of our coalition partners as they continue to support this effort. And President Trump will have the opportunity on May 25th to discuss these initiatives with our NATO partners, our NATO allies, all of whom are members of our coalition. Very briefly, other non-military elements of our coalition include counter-finance, counter-foreign fighters, counter-messaging. So no matter where you are in the world, if you join ISIS or recruit for ISIS or distribute propaganda for ISIS, the global net is closing in. The newest member of our coalition, for example, is Interpol. More than 60 countries are now providing data to Interpol to build a global database of known foreign fighters who've worked with ISIS. That database had only 40 people a few years ago. Now it has 14,000 and continues to grow. So in sum, we're working as a united team at President Trump's direction to destroy ISIS and protect our homeland. And the record is encouraging. Nearly 60,000 square kilometers liberated, none of it retaken from ISIS. All of it is held. 4.1 million people freed. 1.7 million Iraqis now returned to their homes. Propaganda output down significantly, its lowest levels to date. Finances down to the lowest levels to date. Foreign fighters unable to travel to Syria. And those who are already in Syria are more likely than ever to die there. This enemy remains adaptive, and the threat will not end with the battles of Mosul and Raqqa, but the end of the phony caliphate is coming into sight, and without telegraphing anything that is to come, the pressure has only started. And we'll work together as a united team, whole of government, to make sure we do everything we can to defeat ISIS on the battlefield, but also in the financial realm, propaganda realm, and make sure they can never return to areas we retake. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. McGurk. And again, it's an international coalition. It's whole of government here in Washington and across our departments. They've been thrown onto the back foot, but tough fighting lies ahead. They are still dangerous, and it's not going to be over soon, but we're going to continue to press. With that, can we take your questions, Bob?
Mr. Secretary, you described, I think, 2 changes you said the President had made in the general approach in the counter-ISIS campaign. One, I believe you said, was a tactical shift having to do with surrounding ISIS and their strongholds. I wonder if you could explain a little bit the significance of that and say how will that apply to the coming fight in the mid-Euphrates River Valley between Dar ez-Zor and Al-Qaim.
Yeah.
And in the same vein, in that same area, the Syrian government has said that they are going to reassert their authority out in that direction, and that they're going to challenge opposition forces in the south. I'm wondering, given the Russian support for them, how will you navigate that sort of battleground without getting further embroiled in the civil war?
Yeah. Navigating this battleground, this complex battleground, is challenging. We deconflict, as you know, with Russia, maintaining an open deconfliction line with them that's used constantly. But if I was to talk to the tactics, because they actually impact your second question, by taking the time up front to surround these locations instead of simply shoving them from one to another and actually reinforcing them as they fall back, based on the recommendation we made and the direction that President Trump took, we now take the time to surround them. And why do we do it? Because the foreign fighters are the strategic threat should they return home to Tunis, to Kuala Lumpur, to Paris, to Detroit, wherever. Those foreign fighters are a threat. So by taking the time to deconflict, to surround, and to then attack, we carry out the annihilation campaign so we don't simply transplant this problem from one location to another. And that's the approach we take that basically threads the needle on a very complex battlefield. Go ahead, please.
What about out there in that valley area, sir? How are you going to apply that out in the valley when you got that long 100?
I'll leave that to the generals who know how to do those kinds of things. We don't direct that from here. They know our intent is the foreign fighters do not get out. I leave it to their skill, their cunning to carry that out.
Mr. Secretary, I want to follow up on that. As you said, we will not stop after Raqqa. You move down the Euphrates River Valley. You have Dar ez-Zor there with Syrian troops located there. And I understand some small numbers are still moving that way. And then to the west, you have Al-Tanf, which you airstrikes hit some Shia militias heading toward El Tanf. We have U.S. trainers. The Russians struck there at El Tanf last year. So given those two areas, are you worried about El Tanf continuing to be, a place where